So this is part 1 of the lecture for September 15th. My voice is still not what I would like it to be, and I figured that it might be easier for me to record this. I can then play it to you in class if that's what you guys want, or you can watch it at another point in time and we can extend some of our birding hours. So I'm going to do part of the lecture this way and the rest in class on September 15th. This gives you an idea of what the agenda is for that day. So in the recording, I'm going to be covering the senses and vocal apparatus section, as well as the flamingos and the albatross, but the rest will be covered during lecture time on September 15th. So when we talk about birds' senses and vocal apparatus, we're talking about a system with very well-developed sensory capabilities. The birds not only have a great ability to make noises and hear them, but they have incredible vision, some of them color and even UV vision. A bird, when it's flying, is moving rapidly in a three-dimensional space. This means it must be able to process not only the noises it's hearing, the noises it's making, but also everything that's happening around it within that three-dimensional space. This requires a brain with a large amount of processing quality. Some birds, in addition to their regular senses, also have tactile sensors in their bills. We'll talk about this a bit with our sandpipers and the birds similar to that who have the ability to feel food when it's moving in the sediment. And a few species, it also appears that smell may be significant, particularly the ability to smell home or to navigate by scent. So understanding what's going on in their environment not only allows them to react to what they're seeing, but it may be incredibly important for migrating or moving from one area of the territory to another area of the territory. Vision is the dominant sense for most birds. There are some birds where it may not be vision, it may really be another sense such as smell, or perhaps some other ability to understand spatial orientation. For some owls, you could probably argue that it is sound, but dominant sense for the majority of birds does appear to be vision. This is the sense that they processed, generally speaking, the best as well. As a matter of fact, some birds retain their sense of vision even when they are sleeping. So this means that they may sleep with their eyes open and they're still sensing the visual world around them while asleep. Think about how amazing that sense would be for you guys, because right now, maybe you could be sitting there with your eyes wide open, sleeping, and it would be lovely. I know there are days when I attend meetings and I wish I had that sense. Definitely not. But we all kind of feel that way at times, right? But for birds and for some small mammals, this does seem to be a way that they respond to the world around them. The optic lobes of the brain for these birds are very large, as is the midbrain, because the midbrain is where they are doing the processing of visual and auditory information. So their brains are specialized for their lifestyles. Generally speaking, the eyes of birds are so large relative to the skull that they cannot rotate the eyes, that in order to see around them, they may need to rotate the actual entire head. And some eyes are so large that the brain is actually displaced within the skull casing because of the size of the eyes. The vision of birds is 2 to 3 times sharper than that of the vision of humans. Their eye shape, particularly in raptors, is elongated, and this allows them to increase the sharpness of the images they're seeing. So it's more than 2 to 3 times sharper than what we see. Diurnal birds have eyes with retina with many more cones than other birds, in part because this allows them to see more color, whereas some of your nocturnal birds are going to have more rods, which allows them to see at low light levels. And the back of the bird's eye is flatter than it would be of a similar mammalian eye. And what this allows is the bird to have a wider in-focus viewing area. So the shape of the eye and the relationship of the eye to the brain should suggest to you the importance of vision for birds. Also in their eyes, they have structures called oil droplets. The oil droplets come in a variety of colors such as red, orange, yellow, and even green. And this enhances their color vision. It allows them to not only sharpen the colors that they're seeing, but to also reduce the glare from colors and potentially also the glare of the sun. So these oil droplets do give them a very good lens into what they're looking at. And we believe these droplets act as filters. The colors of the droplets are going to combine with the photoreceptor cells and the different visual pigments, allowing the bird to have a truer picture, or at least a truer picture to the bird, of what they're seeing. We know that water birds have a lot of red oil droplets, whereas birds like nighthawks or nightjars, that are aerial hawkers of insects, have a lot of yellow droplets. We still do not have a complete understanding of how these oil droplets function well for the birds and why some have different colors than others, but we know it must be related to how they're able to see. Nocturnal birds, as I mentioned, have more rods. They also have fewer cones in their eyes than the birds who are active during the diurnal times. And this would be because they don't need to see color if everything is almost dark anyway. The fovea, which is the region of the eye concentrated with cones and a very few area of rods, it's near the optic nerve, is high developed in birds that need to have sharp vision. This is actually a critical part of their eye because it allows them to aid in understanding the distances, and we believe this is what allows birds to have a binocular vision effect. So the fovea, with its high amount of development, is good at sensing distance and also allows the eye shape and structure to be binocular. There are some birds which can see into the UV range. This allows them to see UV colorations on their plumage, such as we see with the hummingbirds. It allows them to see the urine in mice trails. And for hummingbirds, we also know it allows them to see images superimposed on the petals of flowers that help them figure out where to find the nectar. And it appears that birds can discern polarized light in helping set themselves up for navigation, and they set up at a specific angle from the sunlight. So clearly vision is important. But hearing is another sense that matters greatly for these birds. Birds do lack any conspicuous external ear, so what we think of as an ear. But their auriculars, or their ear coverts, are specialized feathers that do protect the ear opening. So there is an ear opening with feathers over top of it. But there's very little resistance to sound from these feathers, and it may only be one layer of feathers that are covering it. Their outer ear still does have a shape to it that allows the noise to be funneled directly into the middle ear and then into the inner ear. We see that this funneling becomes extensive in birds like owls. The cochlea is the sound receptive organ inside of the ear of the bird, much like it is for us. But they only have one bone in their ear, the columba, which is going to transmit sound. So think of this as being similar to the fused, if you were to fuse the three bones of our inner ear. And they have a very large tympanic membrane, which, not shockingly, is going to enhance their auditory sensitivity by giving a larger surface area for noises to be gathered upon and amplified from. Nocturnal birds have better hearing receptors and more hearing receptors than do diurnal birds, which, when you just think of it, makes perfect sense. Birds that are nocturnal may use hearing more than they use vision, and by having the ability to hear better and or to hear more, it allows them to react better to the world around them. Birds as a group hear a wider range of sounds than humans do, and wider than some mammals, but not all mammals. Owls are the most acoustically sensitive of all birds. And one of the things that help owls with this is that they can actually change the shape of their facial ruff or of their facial feathers, and this allows them to direct the sound into the ear canals so that they're able to use their facial features to gather sound and pass it into the ear and eventually to the brain. Woodpeckers are remarkable because they can hear grubs and insects moving beneath the bark of the tree. So when a woodpecker is pecking on bark, do not expect it's just randomly pecking. They're actually pecking at areas where either they hear something or they're pecking in an area to get a better place in which to hear the insects moving within the tree. Pigeons, we have observed, can detect infrasounds that are rumbles that precede earthquakes. We do not think pigeons are the only birds that can do this, as we know that before an earthquake or a tsunami or another sort of natural disaster, birds tend to react in ways that are interesting and different from how humans are reacting. So maybe they can hear these things before they happen. Each individual species of birds is going to have their own specialized hearing range. So do not expect that all birds can hear earthquakes or that all birds can hear things moving beneath the bark of trees. Each group's hearing is going to be specific for their evolutionary history and the way that they react to the world around them. So if birds can hear, they're also going to need to produce sound, because one of the things that most people first comment on when they think about birds is their songs. The most important auditory stimulus for birds are going to be the sounds of other birds. These birds are going to be their rivals, their mates, or their young. And bird songs and calls teach us a lot about communication. Not only the communication between birds, but we're also using how birds understand each other's communication styles to figure out how behavior and neurobiology are closely related for all organisms. So what we're learning from bird communication is influencing what we understand about all animal behavior, but also the way that all animals communicate, including humans. When the bird goes to make a sound, what is happening is that the air is vibrating across a thin membrane. This vibration across the membrane creates the sound. The place where the sound is created is the syrinx. This is found above the trachea, and as air is forced through the trachea, the noise is going to be made in this region. Think of this as the voice box of the bird. But this is much more elaborate than our larynx. There's a lot more structures here. And it is more complex because nearly all the air that passes through it is used to make sound. This is certainly not true of our voices. The musculature of the syrinx allows for what we would say is very much unparalleled variety in bird songs and remarkable modulation of the muscles and the air forcing through here. This is because it straddles both of the tracheal tubes of the bird, which means that the bird can actually make two separate sounds in the syrinx at one time. This is not something we are capable of doing with our larynx. But these birds can make two sounds at the same time, two very different sounds at the same time, allowing their sound production to be unrivaled within the animal kingdom. There are some species, however, of birds that lack the ability to use their laryngeal muscles very well. So their amounts of vocalizations are going to be somewhat limited. They may not be able to make much in the way of noises, and they may not be able to make the two noises at once like some species can. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of birds with this in the future. But one group in particular are the passiformes, also called the Oscians. These are your regular perching birds. So this would be a lot of the birds that you're used to thinking about. The chickadees, the titmice, the nuthatches, the sparrows, the red-winged blackbirds, the mourning doves, the catbird you're also fond of by now, the mockingbird. Some of the birds within this group have some of the most complex laryngeal muscles that exist. And the group with the complex laryngeal muscles are the Oscians. The groups that don't have the complex musculature we call the suboscines, which are generally not your perching birds. But the song complexity is not entirely related to the syrinx, which we would have expected and did expect for quite some time. It appears that the suboscines know their songs. They're innate, so they know them from birth. They're born with that knowledge and they don't learn them. Whereas the oscines may have some innate songs, but they learn most of their songs. And they're capable of learning greater vocabularies of songs than are the suboscines. The final types of senses we're going to discuss are taste, smell, and what we detect as other. These senses are going to be much secondary compared to vision and hearing. And taste is fairly poorly developed in most birds. They have a few taste buds that are located near the rear of the mouth. And we believe that, generally speaking, the taste buds are used to figure out whether the food should be swallowed or should it be spit out. Smell, though, we always thought was poorly developed because the olfactory bulb in the brain is small. But we're realizing this isn't true at all. As a matter of fact, smell can be well developed. Vultures, tube noses, and nocturnal birds use their sense of smell significantly. Turkey vultures can detect ethylene mercaptan, which is one of the byproducts of the decaying process. And this helps them to locate their prey. So they're using their smell to find their prey, not just their eyesight as they're circling above. Ground nesting birds and colonial nesting birds, as well as water birds, carnivorous birds, and piscivorous, or fish-eating birds, tend to have very large olfactory bulbs compared to the rest of the birds when you look at the bulb size to the brain size. We believe this is because they use their scent to find prey. In addition, homing pigeons are known to use scent when they're finding their way home in their last couple of areas where they're kind of marking their pathway back home. Or they're known to use it as they're trying to figure out, now which way do I go from this river? Which smell is the most appropriate for the way that is home? Some birds also have the ability to detect the Earth's magnetic field, and they may use it for navigation during their migratory pathways. The birds that are able to do this actually have tiny crystals of magnetite that's embedded in their eye. And we believe this magnetite that's in the eye allows them to sense, not quite see, but at least sense the magnetic field, and that is how they set up which path to use for migration. So they are able to actually detect the idea of both north and south by looking, or at least sensing the magnetic field around them. This is very remarkable and very interesting because we're not sure how the birds develop this magnetite in their eyes. We just know that it's there. And that is all we're going to go over for senses right now. So the first place we're going to go is to speak about the flamingos. These birds are described as tall, distinctive-looking aquatic waders. When you see a flamingo, you know you have seen a flamingo. They have long necks, long legs, pink plumage, a very, very, very distinct bill that is deeply down curved. They nest in colonies in saline lakes, coastal lagoons, or in salt ponds. But they have been known to use freshwater wetlands as well. If they're in North America, it's probably because they escaped from captivity or because they're in a zoo. If they're native, many of them have wandered north from the Caribbean or Mexico. Wandering being not really a migration, but a movement outside of normal range that's in a nearby range. Currently, we've put flamingos in their own order because we don't actually know where they go. When we look at their taxonomy, it's complex. Superficially, they look like storks and cranes and spoonbills. But they don't go there. That's not their category. They have a really strange mix of features. They have this highly specialized bill. It's not like anything that we see in other birds. They have this really long neck and these really long legs, and they're pink. They're tall like a heron, Your book describes them as tall like herons, webbed toes like ducks, a honking call like a goose, and they secrete a milk-like substance for feeding their young like pigeons do. We still put them in their own order because all of these put together means we have no idea where they belong in the grand scheme of bird family tree. So they are omnivores. They eat both meat products as well as plant products, insects, crustaceans, mollusks, and then algae, small seeds. They do most of their feeding by filtering through their beak, so they filter the prey out of the water, but they've been known to grasp larger prey items. If there's not enough water and they're trying to find food, they're known for digesting mud in with the food when there's not enough water to filter things correctly through their bill. When they're feeding, they turn their head upside down, submerged, and it's facing backwards with the front of the bill opening facing towards the feet of the birds, and the bill's going to be parallel to the substrate. So it's going to be above the substrate, not at an angle pointing down. They're then going to use the lamellae on the bill to filter. So they'll bring a mouthful of water in, and then they're going to vibrate their jaw in order to move the water out through the lamellae and leave behind the food in their mouth, which they're then going to consume. This is kind of similar to the ducks using their lamellae, except the head is entirely upside down and backwards, not directly in front of the body like we saw with the ducks. When flamingo breed, it is quite an interesting thing to behold. We're going to watch a video of this because, well, we have to. When they're getting ready to breed, the group is going to have this synchronized breeding dance, if you will, within a colony. The birds are going to do wing saluting. There's a wing leg stretch that is very important for group behavior. They will twist their heads and preen their feathers. They will move their heads from side to side in a somewhat irregular, but seems to them, good manner, and they march as a group across the entire wetland. It is quite a sight to behold, which is why we much watch it. But these birds, when they're going to breed, they breed in a large colony, and the colony is a necessity to set up breeding. They must have the other birds around to go through this breeding display with each other. And one of our concerns for their conservation is that if the group gets too small, they may not breed because they may not be going through the behaviors necessary to set up pair bonds and to allow for copulation, which would mean there would be no more offspring. They build their nest mounds very, very, very close together. But they don't breed every year. They breed only in years when the environmental conditions are going to allow them to support their offspring. They also will not do their display unless there's a big enough group. So breeding can be put off by a small group or by bad environmental conditions. They lay one egg. If that egg is destroyed, they may replace it, and both parents will share their incubation duties. The young will leave the nest at age 5 to 12 days, but they depend on their parents for food, which is like that milk-like secretion for the first little bit, and then the parents are going to teach them how to find food on their own. But young flamingos, as you know, are not pink. They are grayish to maybe a whitish coloration. This is because it takes several years for them to build up enough pink pigment. The pink pigment comes from the tiny shellfish and shrimps that they eat. As a matter of fact, flamingo feathers lose their pink if they're taken off the flamingo and they're off of the flamingo for too long. And flamingos without the right diet lack the pink coloration. We are concerned about the conservation status of the flamingos. The Caribbean population is down to about 80,000 individuals in 4 colonies total. This is pretty small, remarkably small. If we lose one of these colonies, we've lost a considerable amount of the population. Habitat destruction and human disturbance have played massive roles in their decline. And unfortunately, one type of human disturbance has been the capturing of flamingos for zoos. American zoos may have done better jobs of this than other zoos. And today we're keeping the ones that are breeding within the zoos and even trying to, at some perhaps, create a better breeding stock. But if animals are being taken for zoos, this is this is disturbing the population and may in fact interfere with their breeding behaviors. If they don't have their proper diet, their color fades. As I've mentioned, they lose that pink color and they may die. They were once targeted for use in fashion, particularly for that gorgeous pink coloration. But since we discovered that the feathers will fade once they are plucked because of the lack of the right pigments being fed to them, they were kind of saved, if you will, from the fashion industry because of this factor. And it has allowed the flamingo to not face the pressures that some other birds have faced. The last bird that I'm going to do on this recording is the albatross. These birds are called tube-nosed birds. That is the order that they're under, or that's the group that they're a part of. This is because if you were to look at the top of the nose near where it meets the eyes, it does appear to have a tube-like structure in it. They are some of the largest seabirds. They have very long, narrow wings and long bills. The bills may be brightly colored with red, orange, blue, peach, gray, or orange patches or stripes. And these colorations are important. Their wings, as I mentioned, are long and narrow, and this allows them to be well adapted to life at sea, so they can stay airborne for a long period of time. When they're at sea, they're found around a large food concentration. They're large birds. It takes a lot of food to feed them, and they're going to be found near where that food is. One of the most important habitats they can have, features they can have, is a reliable wind. This allows them to stay aloft looking for food and moving from one place to another without having to provide all of their own locomotion. Their diet is mainly that of squids, which means they're highly pelagic, meaning that they're found far from shore. This is because squids are not found in your coastal waters. So in order to eat squid, they must move far away from coastal waters. And generally speaking, they feed while sitting on the ocean surface, not while in flight. So they'll go down for a squid, eat it, and stay on the water instead of flying away. Their plumages are mainly black, white, and gray, but some adults have orange, gold, or peach head feathers, particularly in the breeding seasons. So breeding. Albatrosses are capable of reproducing at 3 to 4 years of age, but generally speaking, they wait much longer than that to breed. And a breeding cycle, completing a single cycle, may take longer than 1 year. So because of this, they will attempt nesting in alternate years. So not every year, maybe every other year, maybe every second or every third year even. When they nest, they do so in colonies of hundreds to hundreds of thousands of birds in one single colony. And they have elaborate both visual and vocal courtship that occurs not only on land but also at sea. This includes exaggerated postures that they repeat in a specific sequence, but these postures of courtship actually decrease in intensity and in length the longer the pair is together. So the belief is that the longer the pair stays together, the less of this behavior is necessary to maintain that pair bond because they're already well bound to each other. One of the reasons that nesting is not attempted every year is because these are large birds and molting is very energetically expensive. Replacing all of their feathers takes a lot of energy, and this energy reduces the energy that's available to them to do these elaborate courtship behaviors and for the female to produce the egg and then for both parents to take care of the young. So breeding is set up the way it is in order to allow the bird to survive from year to year, which means that breeding can't be done each year for the bird to be able to molt and survive through its own lifestyle. So once the birds have copulated, the next step is feeding. because apparently it's very energetically expensive to do all of these behaviors related to mating. When the egg is laid, it can weigh over 1 pound. This is more than 10% the female albatross's body mass. Hence, that big concern for her not being able to do this year after year. That's a large investment at a time. Because of this, the male is actually going to lay on layers of fat right before the egg is laid, so that when the egg is laid, he has fat stores that he can use up while he incubates the egg. This allows the female to then go out and do feeding to recover the bulk that she lost during the egg formation. So the feeding is happening right after copulation, before that egg is going to be weighed. So it's necessary for them to have that feeding stage in between copulation and egg laying. They will alternate their incubation duties, and they feed their chicks a lovely or disgusting, depending upon your viewpoint, paste of partially digested prey and stomach oil. Tasty. Having said that, their breeding success is only 60%. So 60% of the young that are laid will make it. 40% don't. And then it gets worse, because about 70% of the young die during their first year. So that's 30% of the 60% that might survive. An albatross may not have offspring every year. So if you're concerned that maybe the albatross have some conservation concerns, you might be right. They have low reproductive rates, and it takes a long time to reach sexual maturity. They were massacred for the plume industry in the past. And when you include low reproductive rates, long time sexual maturity, and massive hunting in the past, you're setting up a population for massive vulnerability to declines. We know that they've been killed in collisions with naval ops out of Midway, island of Midway, and this is problematic because we're doing naval operations where the birds are and they're dying. We're doing things exactly where they live. Maybe we need to look at that a little more. The fishing industry is a big problem, not just because the fish are being taken away, but that's part of it. If the albatross don't have the squid and the fish they need, they're not going to make it. But also because albatross are caught as bycatch. Bycatch is a catch-all term for anything caught in nets or on long-line fishing hooks that is not the fish you were aiming for. Which, if you're afraid that means that the albatross end up on the hooks or in the nets, you would be right. When the albatross dive after the squid, if they get stuck in a fishing net, they're going to drown. It's pretty horrible, but it happens much more frequently than I would like to tell you it does. They've dealt with the same pollutant contaminants that we're seeing in a lot of the other shorebirds and large birds of prey. Oil spills have been a particular problem for them because it reduces the waterproofing of their feathers and reduces the ability of the feathers to keep them warm. But one of the biggest problems that we have for albatross, if not the biggest problem today, is that the parents ingest a lot of plastic matter that is floating or along the shoreline, and they in turn end up feeding it to the chicks. In many of the chicks that have been autopsied, their stomachs are full of pieces of plastic trash. Some of it's not identifiable because it's been broken down, but a lot of it is bottle caps and other small pieces of plastic garbage. And the problem with this is that we dispose of some of our garbage in the ocean, which really is not where our garbage belongs, but it's what happens. And these birds are just trying to find food to feed their babies. And the trash looks like, well, something. So they give it a try. It's somewhat devastating. And we're not really sure how to fix this, especially when there are floating plastic patches in the ocean larger than the state of Texas. But if we can reduce the trash that we're making, then maybe these albatross will have a chance. All right, so we're going to do some videos in class, and I'm going to finish the rest of the lecture. Thanks so much for allowing me to do this. I may not end up using this recording, but I'm going to include it here just in case, because my voice is not lasting as long as I would like it to be. So this other set of birds here is the oyster catchers. These birds are pretty distinctive looking in that they are large, kind of bulky, seagull-like birds, but they're black or black and white in coloration. They are shorebirds. Their bills are very distinctive, a reddish orange bill that is long and laterally compressed, so similar to what we see in the sandpipers and the plovers. They have yellow eyes, and their eyes have a reddish orange eye ring around them. They are found living on rocky coasts and found in tidal flats, so mud flats or areas that are sand flats, maybe near salt marshes, but not quite in the marsh themselves. And their call is described as loud and like a piping noise. So similar to what you hear with sandpipers and plovers, but louder and a little deeper in scale. These birds do have some variation to them. The females are the larger birds, and they have longer bills. This may be that it allows the males and the females to exploit slightly different food sources while living in the same area because one has a longer, larger bill than the other. The American oyster catcher males have blacker backs and redder bills than do their female version. The juvenile oyster catchers have a bill with a dusky tip. So it's a black or a grayish tip, like you can see in the picture here, to that orange bill. This can be retained for more than 1 year, so more than through their first year. What this will signal to the other birds is that they're a juvenile. They won't be chased out of an area, and they'll basically be seen as kind of like that annoying kid brother or sister hanging out on the territory and not a threat. Also, their wing coverts are edged with a buff feather. So this allows a buff or a white coloration or a cream on top of the edge of the gray wing tips. So this makes the bird look very different in the juvenile stage from the adults. Once again, allowing it some protection and a chance to learn to become an adult by seeing how the adults interact. This juvenile plumage retains for up to about 4 months, but that dusky tip of the bill can retain for more than a year. Their habitats, well, the black oyster catchers that are all black are found on the rocky shorelines. Pied oyster catchers are found on sandy and muddy substrates, not necessarily on rocky substrates. But their habitat does not vary much seasonally. In North America, these birds are not found in the inland areas. They are only found in coastal regions. In other parts of oyster catcher areas, they may be found closer inland. They're somewhat sedentary. They don't vary seasonally. They may not migrate, and many are completely non-migratory. So sedentary meaning that they don't stray from this area in which they're found. When they roost, they do so communally, meaning that there's a large group of hundreds or more of individuals in a single roosting area. When they forage, they're mainly feeding on mollusks, so oysters and clams and other types of food like that. Oysters would make sense, obviously. Oyster catcher is part of the name here. So you might have already thought they probably eat mollusks or catch oysters. They also eat polychaete worms, amphipods, crabs, barnacles, echinoderms, and sometimes small fish. When they are going at a prey item, they use their red bills in a number of different ways. They'll pry open an area, they'll dig through the sand, probe into the sand, hammer at a shell to get the organism out, stab it, and then maybe stab it and shake it against a rock to crush open the cell or to crush the exoskeleton. But interestingly, they tend to specialize as hammerers or stabbers. You might be assuming correctly about what these do. Those that are hammerers break open the shell by pounding against the shell with the blunt-tipped bill. And those that are stabbers are going to have their pointed bills that they use to pry the shells apart. So they may specialize and feed only in one manner or the other. And there are differences between the sexes as to what they eat, so that slight difference in the size of the bill of the female and the male matters. And seasonally, they will shift their diet a bit. When oyster catchers are found, they tend to be monogamous, and they're incredibly territorial during their breeding season. They are site faithful, meaning that they return to the same site year after year after year. Their breeding displays involve both vocal and visual displays. There's a loud pipping call that works as both a greeting to your mate as well as an aggressive form of communication against an incoming bird. There are visual displays, but these do not involve any flight displays, which makes them different from a lot of other birds we've talked about so far. During courtship, they're going to walk next to each other. They're going to make the same posture while standing next to each other, the posture towards each other. And they will fly together, making a pipping noise, but there's no dives, there's no fly after me kind of antics. It's much more of doing things together in sequence. Like a lot of birds, this sequential ordering of doing behaviors and doing behaviors with each other, we believe helps them make their pair bond very strong. And it seems to be that this style of communication is necessary to build up the behaviors between the male and the female birds. And here we see the American oyster catcher pair doing a nuptial flight. So this flight is important. It does allow them to kind of make their pair bond known. And it might be that a bird from a nearby territory might join, or a couple birds might join together, which might look like the birds are flying nowhere in particular, but it might be because they're all trying to get to know each other and show off who's in what pair. The nests of oyster catchers are located in the open, generally found on beaches, dunes, or rocky areas, kind of along the edges. The exception being that American oyster catchers can be found nesting in salt marshes. Their nest looks like exactly what you see in this picture. Kind of a scrape or a small indent in the pebbly area made by the male. They then are going to lay 2 or 3 eggs into the nest, maybe decorate it with some shells, and well, there we have a nest. A few will actually line it with debris or soft areas, and like you see this one, they may line up larger rocks around the outside for somewhat level of protection. 2 to 3 eggs make up a clutch, and the clutch can be replaced if it is lost. The chicks are going to be dependent on the parents for food for a month and sometimes more. But in the oyster catchers, the young stay with their adults for up to 6 months, learning what they need to learn from their parents of how to be an oyster catcher, and then learning for the next 6 months, so that first entire year of their life, how to be an oyster catcher from the others in their grouping. For the conservation, we're just going to look at the American and the black oyster catchers, the 2 species we have in the US. The American oyster catcher, by the early 20th century, it no longer nested north of Virginia. Historically, it had nested north of there, but we had seen that it started steadily recovering, and it has moved north as it does recover. But it's still vulnerable to beach development, and the population is still small. On the 2014 State of the Birds watch list, it was listed of special concern in many states, and Audubon listed as a conservation concern species in a number of states. One thing that is good for the American oyster catcher is that we've been building sand islands out of dredge spoils as we dredge beaches or dredge offshore from beaches or in tidal channels. And these dredge spoil islands made of sand actually make great new habitat for the American oyster catcher. So some of our coastal development is actually helping a bird species, for once it seems. But for the oyster catchers, there's one main threat that they have for both the American and the black. This is that they're shy birds, very sensitive to human disturbance. All oyster catchers do poorly with human disturbance. So that means that while we may be creating this new area, if it's an area with human disturbance, we may not actually be helping the bird as much as we would like to think we are. The black oyster catcher populations appear to be stable. While the bird is on the watch list, it's because we did see localized declines in it, and it also made that 2014 State of the Birds watch list again. It has been affected by oil spills, particularly oil spills in its breeding grounds, which makes sense because the worst place you can have a natural disaster like an oil spill is in the breeding grounds, because then it's not just the adults that are impacted, but also that year's group of young birds that may be lost because of a natural disaster.